Well, we're coming up on our time pretty soon here. Well, it's about time we got started. I'm Lawrence Diggs, and you're tuned into Brainstorming the Human Connection, brought to you by the South Dakota Humanities Council. We're going to be having a discussion with Nancy Koupal in a few minutes, but I want to encourage those of you who are already signed on to join in the conversation. This is a participation kind of format where it depends on you participating. You can't get more out of it than you put into it, so to speak. So we like to get people to participate, ask questions. And while we're getting started, if you think of something that you'd like some more exploration on, please feel free to write it down. It might be a good idea so that when we go into our more participatory segment of this program, you will already have some interesting questions, or at least things that interest you. Well, welcome, Nancy. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming. And we look forward to a very interesting discussion this morning. I'd like to start off by giving the audience an opportunity to get to know you a little bit. Can you talk to us about where you're from, where you're born, and your schooling, children, or how would you describe Nancy in the kind of the elevator speech of Nancy Koupal?
No, I don't get to give that speech very often, so I'll have to fumble around a little bit. I was born and raised in Mitchell, South Dakota. I went to school at SDHC for my BA. I got my MA at Morehead State University in Morehead, Kentucky, and then spent a couple of years working on my PhD in Madison, Wisconsin. So kind of traveled around a little bit, went back to Kentucky after that, and then came back to South Dakota in 1975. And I've been here ever since. And I have two children, two girls, and they're 10 years apart. And people, I shouldn't say this, but sometimes people say to me, well, was that second one an accident? And I'll say, no, the first one was the accident.
And the trial run, so to speak, right? The test subject.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no matter whether you plan them or not, the first ones are test subjects.
Yes, they are, the poor things. So I was the first one too, so I know.
Yeah.
The thing I would say is I would never recommend having children. You end up with two only children when you have them that far apart.
That far apart, yeah.
It took those kids a long time to learn to appreciate each other. They did. They're sisters now, but it took a long time. I wouldn't recommend it. Yeah.
Well, I suppose, though, that gave you some interesting background and knowledge, probably more than your PhD on this subject of, girls, because you can have an insight that maybe Laura Wilder missed.
Yeah, I don't know. I think Laura Ingalls Wilder had her own troubles. She had one child. Well, she had two, but her little boy died within a month of his birth. So she had her own troubles. She had a strong-minded daughter. So
yeah. And we'll probably get into that to some degree here today. So let's get into your work as an author. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into writing, and what kind of writing do you do, and what informs that?
Well, I would have to say that principally I'm an editor. I as I said, I worked on my PhD, didn't finish it, but I worked on my PhD in English literature. And when we came back to South Dakota in 75, as I said, and I kind of looked around and I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do here? I saw that the South Dakota History Magazine, which was a quarterly scholarly journal, was there and very appealing to me. And I thought, okay, that's the job I want. And I was very fortunate that within a couple of years of that time, the person who'd been the editor resigned. And I had decided that I wanted that job. So I had started to volunteer and work in the Historical Society as a volunteer. And when it came open, then I was positioned to look like a good candidate. So I took it over.
That is strategic planning, I tell you.
Yes, well, with South Dakota, there was one job. You kind of had to figure out how you were gonna make that happen.
Yes.
And and I had the background, with all of I had a foreign languages as my BA, and my MA was in English and linguistics and then English literature. So I had the right background for it. I was, and it was a wonderful job for me. It was just the right thing. And I was able to grow it from just a journal into a press and doing books. And, to be an editor, you have to be able to write, obviously. So that's part of what I do. But I think my best instincts are for editing, not writing.
Okay. Fair enough. Well, let's get into our subject here today. And it's worth talking about at first, your book. Tell us about that book.
The book that's coming out within the next few weeks is called Pioneer Girl, the Revised Text. And it's the third of 4 books that the Pioneer Girl Project at the South Dakota State Historical Society is publishing. And the very first one was called Pioneer Girl, the Annotated Autobiography, which was edited by Pamela Smith-Hill. And it contained the original handwritten manuscript that Laura Ingalls Wilder presented to her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, to edit in 1930. And we annotated that. Rose Wilder Lane had circulated that manuscript to New York publishers, and nobody took it. It was not ready for prime time. But so in 2014, when we published that at the State Historical Society Press, it had been laying around for 60 years. And so it was a real coup. And we had put together the Pioneer Girl Project, which is a team of researchers to do the background research, to look into, just all aspects of the manuscript and its evolution. So the book we're doing now, or the one that's coming out now, is the next phase in that project, because Lane took that handwritten manuscript and began to type it. And as she typed, she edited. And so there are 3 edited versions of that same manuscript. And that's what this book is. It's looking at these edited versions, what Lane tried to do to make it marketable, what she did and didn't do to make it marketable, and where it's going to go from there, because this is going to become the wildly popular, best-selling Little House books. but not
So, so it's essentially a book about a book or
That's
about
right.
books.
That's exactly right. And about the relationship between the author and her editor,
Right, right.
who is also her daughter.
Okay, so then that's where we get into the thick of it, you know.
Yes.
So can you tell us something about how her daughter came to be her editor?
Oh, well, that's it's an interesting evolution. Her daughter, Wilder got married at 18 in 1885. Her daughter was born the following year when she was 19. And so they were just a scant generation apart. They both had really strong personalities. And I think sometimes it's really hard to like Rose Wilder Lane because she's really got a hard edge to her. And she's a bully. You know, she'll just run her mother in circles at times. But Lane was a self-made woman. She graduated from high school in 1 year at 17. She became a telegrapher, a telegraph operator in Kansas City. And she went out to San Francisco in 1908 and began working in 1915 for the San Francisco Bulletin. And the Bulletin was a big player in the San Francisco market at that time. It was part of the yellow journalism movement. So there were all these exposés, and Lane was out there. There's pictures of her with a backpack, with a pack strapped over her front. She's out investigating people, dams, politics. She's just an aggressive reporter and writer. And so that's where she learned her craft. And she learned it in an interesting school. It's an overly dramatic, not always careful of the facts kind of school that she learned her writing in. She went from there, she began doing biographies, books. She did a biography of Charlie Chaplin, Herbert Hoover, Jack London. And then she began to write serials for magazines. And the long and short, she became very well connected. I think that's important to know. She knew all of the top writers and editors in the field at that time. So she had the background, and from the time she was probably 22, she was starting to coach her mother in how to write, how to make money, how to, put schemes together to improve her condition. So
was her mother not a writer before her daughter became an editor?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, Wilder started writing in about 1911, and she wrote newspaper columns and articles for farm women. So she was a writer, and in fact, she was a decent writer, but she wasn't of her daughter's caliber. And her daughter thought she shouldn't mess around with those little papers and should be writing for the big markets. So her daughter would go out and find her assignments for like McCall's Magazine or Country Gentleman, which was a big magazine at that time. And so she'd coach her. Okay, Mama Bess, she called her. Okay, Mama Bess, this is how you write this. And then what?
Oh, I was going to say, so we can say that she more or less shaped her mother's writing career.
Yes, she really pushed her mother. that's not, that doesn't leave Laura Ingalls Wilder with any motivation of her own, and she had plenty. She
Yes,
was
sure.
very motivated. She
Yeah.
was a working farm woman. She worked for a farm loan association. She was a motivated woman who was actually the breadwinner for the family for the most part, because Almanzo, or Manley, her husband, had been crippled in their early marriage
Okay.
by diphtheria.
Okay. Oh, by diphtheria. Okay. So now we move into this mother-daughter relationship, because if I understand it right, that's kind of the crux, or that's a kind of a central theme in this, is that relationship, because that's really what's shaping the book
That's right.
and shaping how we have experienced that book. So can you tell us a little bit more about that relationship and how that happened?
Well, I think, I think it came along, I think it came into being fairly naturally. As I said, Rose Wilder Lane was, I think we would call her today, bossy. She just knew what was right for everybody to do. And so she had amazing success at a pretty young age. And so she just really had no qualms about her own ability or her own rightness in what she was doing. And so she was, and Wilder could see that she was successful. I mean, had books. She had articles in McCall's and Good Housekeeping and these magazines. So she could see that she was a success, and she wanted some of that. She did. She was ambitious.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure I answered your question there. I kind
Well,
of track.
yeah, it partially answered it, but I want to get deeper into how the relationship kind of developed, especially vis-a-vis the, how it impacted the book. Do you have any sense of, like, well, if her daughter had not been, sort of part of this equation,
That book
would it
wouldn't
be
have
even, would have it had even been a book?
No, I think you can say that categorically, because her daughter was not only her editor, her daughter was the agent. The daughter went out and sold the book. She had a literary agent herself in New York named Carl Brandt, and she first got him to market the manuscript. When they were no longer working well, she got a new agent, which was George By, and gave the manuscript to him. And George By became Wilder's agent as well. And when they couldn't sell the adult manuscript, then Lane took it to her friends, and they took it upon themselves to start marketing it to children's publishers.
So did she
rewrite that? There wouldn't be a book.
Okay. So now, did they rewrite the book for children?
That's the fourth book. That's the next book I'm doing. But yes, they did.
They did rewrite the book for children.
Well, they took the memoir and took a small part out of it that they thought was just going to be a little picture book for kids. And it became a chapter book for young, third kids 8 to 10, and the rest is history.
Okay, all right. So underneath the business part, the technical part, there is personal parts, things that go along with day-to-day living and this decision. Does that play into the relationship developing the book, or is it separate? How would you say?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to answer that. While, you know, they both had their own styles. And Wilder, on a day-to-day basis, would write out things by hand. And, you know, I think she carefully read her daughter's letters. She understood what her daughter wanted her to do, and she would write it out and do it to the best of her ability. And then Lane, who is off living her own life in New York or Paris, or she worked for the Red Cross and was in Armenia for a number of years. She was very well traveled. So you'd have this farm wife writing out these books in Missouri, where she lived, and Lane would respond to them wherever she happened to be.
So it must have taken quite a bit of research to find this out, because you probably didn't do first person interviews.
No,
so can you tell us? Yeah, can you tell us about how you discovered these insights into the relationship and their relationship to the book?
Well, Lane wrote all the time. She wrote diaries, she wrote journals, she wrote letters. There is just a voluminous amount of written material that comes from Rose Wilder Lane. And it's at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa. The bulk of it is. And so that's just an incredible resource. But it is a resource you have to be careful of, because it's a one-sided resource. So what you're hearing is from Lane. And Lane, I think, had some emotional problems that were, that just play through her material, so that you can see when she's just really unhappy with herself and unhappy with her mother, unhappy with those around her. So she's really kind of brutal in some of her writing. So the challenge is to balance all of that. You've got a lot of material, but you can't take it all at face value.
Sure. Now, did she have a family? Did Lane have a family?
Not really. She got married when she was young. She got married in 1909, but she got divorced by 1919. And so she was always Rose Wilder Lane. She never remarried, but she had a number of children that she more or less adopted through the years, and took care of and put through school and that sort of thing. And so that's where her family comes from, is there was an adopted grandson.
Sure. Now, these kind of relationships don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in culture, so to speak. Did you find anything out about the women and their daughters in that time period? And well, that's the first question. Did you find anything out about the kind of typical relationships, so we can compare their relationship to the others?
Well, I have a friend, and she wrote a essay in the Pioneer Girl Perspectives. Her name's Paula Nelson. And, I've asked Paula many times. She's his intellectual historian who specializes in women and women's relationships. And I have asked her many times about that Wilder and Lane relationship. How did that work? And she said, in her opinion, Lane was just a very difficult personality, would have been hard for anyone to handle. She was a force of nature in many ways. And I think her mother, who was kind of a pioneer from that pioneer generation where emotions were sort of left to the side. You didn't talk about them. You didn't deal with them. I think Lane was exceedingly difficult for her to handle, and vice versa. They were hard for each other, I think. And I know that Carolyn Fraser, who did the Pulitzer Prize winning biography of Lane, called Prairie Fires, she felt that Lane had probably been traumatized as a young child with her father and mother both being very ill, the loss of a brother, a fire that burned down their house, that she felt that I think that Lane was sort of recovering from that all of her life. So those are some of the issues that are there. I'm not looking so much at them. I'm looking at that personal relationship as I am at the professional relationship, or the relationship between an author and her editor. And I guess I would have to say that in the beginning, it's very unequal. The daughter is the predominant person. She's got the experience. She's got the voice of righteousness. She's telling her mother how it has to be done. But gradually, you see, this is Wilder's story. This is her life. She knows this story. She knows these people. She knows what she wants to say about them. And slowly, she builds her own ability to fight for what she wants. And she's very good at it. By the time they get to the end of their relationship, when they're writing their very last book, if she wants something changed, she changes it. She gets it done. So she's just no longer her daughter's.
She's matured.
She has matured. Yeah, very well put. I was going to say she's no longer her daughter's Patsy, but I don't know that she was ever a Patsy. But she could be. Lane had the upper hand for many years in that relationship.
So that brings us into maybe some discoveries, because you said, if I understood you, you kind of focus more on that personal relationship, did you say?
More on the professional relationship.
More on the professional relationship.
The relationship between editor and author, because that's where my expertise is. So I'm not a psychologist or so the personal relationship, I kind of have to rely on what others think about that.
Oh, okay. So looking at the professional relationship, how would you say it compares to other editor writers relationship vis-a-vis women working together?
I think it's very similar. And I think it's very similar to what you still see today, where, I read a lot. I read a lot of fiction. And so I always read the acknowledgments. I read the whole book. So I read the acknowledgments, and you'll find that a lot of authors will say things like, this book wouldn't be the book it is if it wasn't for my agent and my editor. And I think the thing that people don't really understand is that editors and agents are shapers. They're developers. They're the ones that take the core of an idea and grow it into some of the wonderful books that we read. That no book is really an individual accomplishment. It's a group effort. And most authors are very good at thanking those who did that for them. And I think that it is exactly how it has always been. this relationship. What seems so peculiar to people is that it's a mother and daughter, as opposed to two strangers who meet professionally.
Though sometimes, even though they're mother and daughter, they're also strangers.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
in a strange land.
Yeah, and their relationship was very fraught. I don't mean to say that it wasn't. There were jealousies. There were Lane, I think, misled her mother in what she was going to do with her mother's material. And that almost destroyed their relationship at one point. When Lane did a best-selling book based on Wilder's memoir.
Ooh.
Well, yeah, and they kind of had an understanding that was going to happen. But I think what Wilder didn't understand was that Lane was going to use the same characters, the same names, the same location. What she thought when she said to her daughter, yeah, go ahead and make fiction of it, was something completely different, that it wouldn't be a part of her story.
Right. And you could feel, I suppose, as the original author, you could feel hijacked if, because it doesn't occur to you with your daughter to look at the fine print,
Yes,
so
right.
you have a kind of a handshake, abstract understanding that
Right.
once it comes into focus doesn't look like the thing that was the blurred image.
No.
Good.
Exactly.
Well, I want to give our other participants a chance to join in this conversation. So have we raised any questions that any of you would like to ask Nancy?
I'm sure.
Sometimes it takes people a while to find their notes.
I see we do have a question in the chat from Thea. Would you like me to read it out?
Oh yeah, would you? I didn't see the chat.
Sure. Yeah, so Thea Miller-Ryan asks, can you think of other authors whose books transitioned from meant for youth to being accepted and loved by all generations? So that's kind of the first part, transition from meant for youth to being accepted and loved by all generations. And then regarding the Little House books, do you think these books did this because of the TV show, or would they have made that transition to being so beloved anyway? Maybe they already were beloved, I don't know. So what do you think was the effect of the TV show? And do you think that Wilder is unique in the fact that these youth books are so beloved by all generations?
No, I don't think she's unique. I think there are a lot of authors that are similar. I think you look at L. Frank Baum's books, for example, the Oz books. They were for children, and they're beloved yet today, some of them. I think there are other authors like can't think of her name, Matt Montgomery, who wrote the Annie books. Lucy Montgomery, I think her name was. There are a lot of examples of that sort of thing. Now, the second part of the question, the TV show. I think the books were beloved before the TV show. I think the TV show really gave them new life and gave Wilder and her visions new life. But they also imposed their own visions. You have, I can't think of Michael Landon with, I tried to watch that show a couple times, and, it was worth at least one male crying jag per episode from what I could tell. I just really could not get into that. It just did not speak to me, but it speaks to a whole generation of people that came after.
Do you think that actually watching if you're really invested in the book and you are a reader, like you're saying, I'm an avid reader, it
Right.
may be the way that you consume information too, might be more in the book form than watching a TV. I mean, because there seems to be those kind of people. Some people, like if they read a book, that's more, let's say, it's more striking to them. It's more impressive in terms of like what you see, how you imagine what's going on, relative to TV,
Right.
where, you know what I mean? Some people, and then some people, TV is the opposite, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's where you encounter it first, actually. From me, the TV series just, I mean, there was a son, for goodness sakes. The Wilders never had a son. I mean, they did have a son, but he died at 9 months or something like that. So there was just, it was too far from reality for me to find acceptable. Whereas, there are a lot of shows that I like a lot that I'm sure diverge from the original book, but I've never read the book, so
Yeah.
I can be happy with the show. So
Right. So then that brings us back to Lane and the let's say conflict that she had with her mother about fictionalizing her what her mother was working on. Is this sort of another version of that, where the TV show has fictionalized the fiction?
that's a good observation. I think that both Lane and Wilder were very interested at getting what they considered the truth. And the truth did not rely so much on fact as it relied on the what they considered the reality of the situation.
The perception, maybe.
The perception, yeah. It might not have been the fact, but it was true. And you hear that language between them a lot. And you hear that language, I think, a lot in studies of English literature. There's a sense that the truth is more important than the facts. And that's, I don't know if that answered the question, but that's kind of what I was thinking about.
Yeah. I think it starts to get to the question, because then that has to do with both the book and the TV show. And I think that is a conflict we have, like in any kind of writing of like a historical event, is that a lot of what gets written has to do with the emotional impact, because if it had no emotional impact, probably nobody would write about it because they didn't feel anything, And when it does, somehow the writing has more to do with that, justifying that emotional experience. So the facts can be left out, tweaked a bit, or added, to meet that emotional need. Do you find that in general in these kind of books?
Yeah, I think you do. I think, you find that Wilder, for example, is writing about the 1870s, the 1880s, but she's doing it in the 1930s. And so she's doing it from the point of view, she's got distinctive thoughts about that past and how that past was better than her present. And so that informs her books. Kids today don't appreciate what we did back in the 1880s. That life was harder than I don't know that she would say it was harder, because I think she loved her life. She loved her youth, and she loved the possibilities of it. And she didn't feel that the children of the 1930s were doing, she thought they were pampered, They were not being given the opportunity to grow as she had grown. So that is informing those books. And I would say that the same is true in the 1970s and 80s when the television show was being created. It was Michael Landon's view of the world that was informing those books. And his sense of social justice and that sort of was informing those TV programs. So I think even though we're writing about the past, we're always somehow involved in our present. And that shows in each generation of the story.
Mhm, mhm. I think whenever you're putting together a book or a TV program, you're challenged with trying to one, represent what happened, to some extent, but at the same time, you're trying to keep it interesting. And I think that's where the sort of like you were talking about the editor shaping a book. That is often where editors and writers have a conflict because the writer has a story they want to tell. And the editors are often trying to shape the story in a way that it's more appealing to more people. Would you say that's a fair statement?
I'd say that's a fair statement. And I think what you find is that once authors accept that their editor actually knows the audience better than they do, they usually can reach a compromise that's going to work to get that to get the book to do what they both want it to do. I think that one of the things too with Lane is she had these ideas about how you write. One of her ideas that just about drove her mother crazy was that it's always from the main character's point of view. And so you can't switch characters. You can't have people like Pa telling the story all the time. Laura's gotta see it.
Yeah.
And I mean, the things they would do to determine if Laura could see something were just absolutely ludicrous at times.
Like what? Give us an example.
Well, one example I remember is that they were trying, Pa in the long winter, Pa goes off to shovel snow. He goes on a railroad hand cart off down the track to shovel snow. And Lane says, Laura couldn't have seen that. So she can't talk about that. Well, Laura was determined that Wilder was determined that was part of the story. So they mapped the town of DeSmith, the railroad depot, the tracks from all different directions to see where she'd have to stand to see that on her way to school. But that kind of thing, I mean, and absolutely, it keeps the focus of those books on or on the character.
Right. So this is I say coming of age of a genre of books that have to do with, let's say, historical fiction, things that are based in actual events.
Right.
But to create the story, one takes liberties with the facts in order to make the story interesting. Have you found, as a person who's in that kind of business, have you found that people are getting better at that or not?
Oh, well, I think the thing to remember, and Lane tells her mother at this time, at one time, is there's all kinds of facts and there's all kinds of truth. And there's only so many that you can put in any given book. And I think that's right. You know, Wilder says to an audience in Detroit at one time, you know, I told everything I said was the truth, but it just wasn't all the truth. And and there's some truth to that. But she knew by, you know, the fact that she knew she was writing fiction at that point. This is 1937. She's just finished her, what is it, fourth or fifth book, On the Banks of Plum Creek. She's just finished. And she's aware that she's, I think I lost my train of thought there, but I think what I'm trying to say is that she knows that she's not telling all the truth. She knows that she's writing fiction. She knows that some of her characters weren't even around at that time. So she's, you know, the person who's writing historical fiction is creating a mixture of fact and fiction, and they know it. I mean, there's nothing that can be done about it. If you're trying to write a memoir, you know, so many people have thought through the years that Wilder's novels were history. Well, they're not. They're novels, and she was aware of that. But she tried to keep them true to her reality.
Right. So this brings up an interesting conundrum, shall we say, for writing in general. You know, as a culture, and I would say world culture, going forward, human culture going forward, we will need to understand as much as possible what has happened before us with as much detail as possible. So it seems that we're running into a conflict now because, you know, it's like we want a spoonful of sugar that makes the medicine go down, but we're diabetics, you know,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it is to say that there's some contraindications that spoonful of sugar that we needed just to swallow it will end up doing as much harm as we hope to get good from the historical fact. So that as people start to read these things and not even knowing that, okay, this character is made up, this character is made up, this scene is made up, but this part is true, because I don't see any historical fiction that really delineates that clearly, you know. That's like putting the strings on the opera characters, or, you know, you don't want to see those wires. You want to just, you know, suspend disbelief.
Well,
So
yeah.
I'm wondering how that affects, or how it is affecting writing, you know.
Well, you know, I can't tell you. I think we're working hard at saying, okay, this is creative nonfiction. This has to have the facts of this particular genre have to be verified or verifiable.
Right.
Now that doesn't mean it always happens, and you've got famous books out there that purport to be history and are in fact fiction. But I think that it is, I think the fact is that writing is always, what's in a piece is always a choice of the author, or the choice of the collaboration that made that book. So there's never a book that tells it like it is the way it went, you know, the way
it actually was.
No,
Yeah. Maybe that's not even possible.
Yeah,
you know?
I'm not sure that a human's capable.
Yeah. And if they did, it would be so. Could anybody read it? You know, I mean,
exactly. Would you want to? You know.
Yeah. Well, so to me, that it brings up a kind of conundrum, kind of like that conundrum of the Bible, and someone asked a person, have you ever read the Bible? And they said, no, but I watched the movie, And so you start out with the Bible that has, like lots of parts missing, when you look at like the history of how it was put together, there was lots of things that they were on the table too, but they say, well, we don't need to put this, well, how about we put this one? Well, yeah, but let's change it around this way and put it in this order or something like that,
Yeah, exactly.
Well, now
That's happened. That's all happened.
Yeah. So then you go forward and someone says, well, not a lot of people are reading this book, or not enough people are reading this book. Maybe we ought to make a movie that gives people the highlights, but then they have to add things to the continuity department has to become involved and add things. And so by the end, you can just say, okay, is that the thing? How close did it come to the thing, or did it do anything, or did it do harm? It just seems like, is that like something we now have to expect, or maybe always was part of the difficulty in creating at least this kind of books?
I wish I could say. I mean, we've entered into the era of alternate facts, and I don't know what's going to happen from here. But so I know that's not an answer, but
that may be as good an answer as there is, though. Well, okay, so I want to open it up to our audience again. If you don't feel comfortable asking a question with your mic off, maybe you can write it in the chat. But does anyone have any other questions or comments about anything that we've been talking about?
I will jump in quick because I've been thinking about this. Hi, Nancy. One of the things that I think about when I think about the Little House books is how they really progress in not only the characters' maturity level, but the maturity level of the writing style. You start with Little House in the Big Woods. It's very, very simple, very short sentences, and it just gets much more sophisticated as Laura herself grows up and gets more sophisticated. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's something, can you tell from what you've looked at whether that's something that Rose had an influence on? Do you think it was Laura developing as a writer herself? Do you know whether it was intended? Do you have any background on that?
I think they were intending to grow her up, yes. And they talk about that at various times, that she has to grow up. I think the first book and the second book, but especially the first book, it comes really right out of the autobiography, and that simplicity is a part of the autobiography. And it's the simplicity of a small child too, because Wilder is actually, I think, 5 at that time, or 6 in the time she's writing about. And so there's just a simplicity of what she sees, and that will get more sophisticated as she grows older, because what she wants to talk about becomes more sophisticated. She wants to talk about the unfairness of a teacher who's not playing fair. She wants to talk about, all of these more grown-up things. So she's growing up, and yes, that is intentional. They are working at that, and I would say that Wilder is becoming more and more sophisticated in her ability to tell the story. And by the time she's writing about the birthday party, say in the I think it's the Little Town on the Prairie, they go to this birthday party at the depot. By that time, she really knows what she's doing. She's got all of the detail. I mean, the first time you read that story, there's no doer who's making this marvelous meal. It magically appears on the table. But by the time she's writing that, drafting it out for her book, she's got all the details. There's Mrs. Woodward who's being is a character. And so, yes, I think it's definitely intentional, and it's definitely a product of her maturation as an author. And that's part of what you can see because of all this wonderful resource material. You can watch this progression, and you can see, Wilder writes something and Lane will say, well, what color was his suit? Where was he standing? Who's doing what? And pretty soon she doesn't have to prompt. Wilder writes that all in, and you can see that progression.
So tell us a little bit more, because I think you mentioned it, but I didn't. Somehow it slipped. Where did you find the bulk of your material, the most impressive, influential part of your material to help you shape the book that you wrote?
Well, I think it's the thing that's most, as I mentioned, the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library, and all of Lane's papers are there. And she also has collected her mother's manuscripts and her mother's letters. So there's a period of letters from 1937, I think it is, till about 40, that's very, very rich between the two women. There's all these manuscripts, and Wilder started giving her manuscripts away. So there's a couple at the Detroit Public Library. There's one in Pomona, California. And so you track them down, and then you can see this is a rough draft, it's handwritten, and then there's a typed draft. And in the typed draft, Lane will be writing all these things, like I said. Where's he standing? Who's he talking to? What's his name? All these things. And Wilder's writing them in by hand. So you can follow exactly what they're doing.
Interesting.
These manuscripts.
Right. Now, as I understand it, are you going to be part of our book festival?
I am, yes.
Okay, good. That's a perfect segue into talking about the book festival, because people can come and interact with you even more. And it's going to be virtual this year, because the COVIDs have decreed that we will be doing it virtual. And as long as we got Jennifer, who is the honcho of book festivals, can you talk to us, Jennifer, a little bit about what we can expect from the book festival?
Yes, absolutely. We are actually kicking off the virtual 2021 Festival of Books on Saturday morning at 11 o'clock. The Newbery medalist, Kwame Alexander, who is a children's and young adult author and poet, and now a TV producer, because his crossover series is being made into a streaming series for Disney Plus. He is going to be in conversation with Lori Walsh on Saturday morning. And we're going to move on with a couple of other early events. And then we really get into the bulk of the festival, starting with kickoff on September 30th in the evening and going all through that weekend of October 1st through the 3rd. And then we have some extended events going through, I think October 10th is the final event that we have. And that will feature the Pulitzer Prize winning American Indian author and Scott Momaday. So we've got a lot going on, but the bulk of it is on that original festival weekend. You can sign up to get a passcode that will get you into almost all of the festival events free virtually. They will run via Zoom, and about half of them will also be streamed live on Facebook whenever we have the bandwidth, so to speak. So if you go to sdbookfestival.com/virtual, you'll find where you need to get your tickets, how you need to access the events when they're available. And like I said, all but 4 workshops are free. So you'll be able to see Nancy speak a couple of times on Saturday, October 2nd, once about the Pioneer Girl Project and once on a panel that has to do with some of her earlier work on the American Oz documentary on L. Frank Baum. Nancy and Virginia Driving Huck's Navy will be responding to some short clips from that. So,
okay, good. Well, while you were speaking, Jace threw in a question, and we're right at the end of our program, so I wanted to shove that in. She asked which one, mother or daughter, knew or talked about the perceptions of American Indians in these books.
I think they both talked about them. Lane was probably more conscious of things in the 30s and how people thought in the 30s. So she would often talk about nature as it related to the ways in which American Indians were perceived in the 30s. But they both bring that topic up. I would say that Wilder is more conscious of the prejudices of the 1880s than her daughter is.
Okay,
that's a quick answer.
And that's about what we had time for. Thank you for that question, Jace. Next time, please put it in earlier, so because we could really get into some interesting stuff with that. Okay, so anyway, we've come up to the end of our program. I'd like to thank you very much, Nancy, for participating with us. We look forward to interacting with you at the festival, South Dakota Festival of the Book, and we'll see you over there.
All right.
Well, that's all, everybody. Thank you very much.
Yep, thank you.